Good pastors walk a fine line between identifying with and caring for their congregations on the one hand, and being absolutely faithful to the teaching and preaching of the gospel on the other. Many are better at one or the other, but not always both. Today's minor character from the New Testament receives Paul's praise on both counts. And besides all that, he was a devoted lieutenant to Paul, even apparently being imprisoned with him. His name? Epaphras. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Saturday, August 19th, 2023. Epaphras appears in two of Paul's letters, twice mentioned in Colossians and once in Philemon. These three passages paint a picture of a remarkable man. We first meet Epaphras in Paul's opening sentences to the church in Colossae, where he commends Epaphras. Paul writes, "This, that is, the hope contained in the gospel message, you learned from Epaphras, our beloved fellow servant. He is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf, and he has made known to us your love in the Spirit." We often think of Paul being the first to preach the gospel in various locations, but it's clear that he was not alone. While his letters tend to focus on controversies caused by rival preachers whose visions of the gospel stood at odds with Paul's, careful attention to detail reveals that Paul relied on a network of preachers and evangelists both to carry the gospel message and to reinforce Paul's teachings when he left one place and went to another. We saw that with Priscilla and Aquila yesterday. It's difficult to tell with certainty whether Epaphras preceded Paul in Colossae or remained after Paul left. Either way, it is clear Paul depended on him to help spread the gospel. It is possible that Epaphras was a loyal associate working under Paul's authority, and it is possible that he was independent of Paul, on the other hand, but that their approaches to the task of evangelism and their understanding of the gospel message were so similar that they simply became natural allies. What we learn from this particular passage, though, is that not only did the Colossians hear the gospel message from Epaphras, but he also traveled on their behalf to other places. Paul reinforces this when he mentions Epaphras at the end of this letter. He says, "Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ Jesus, greets you. He is always wrestling in his prayers on your behalf, so that you may stand mature and fully assured in everything that God wills. For I testify for him that he has worked hard for you and for those in Laodicea and Hierapolis." So two things jump out at me here. First, his ministry was not only to the Colossians, but to congregations in other places, Laodicea and Hierapolis being the two mentioned here. This speaks to a burning need to spread the good news of the gospel all around that part of the world. And, as if to underline this burning desire, Paul then depicts him as, quote, wrestling in his prayers on behalf of the Colossian church. That's just a striking image to me. We often think of prayer as calm, peaceful. Quiet meditation comes to mind. But prayer as wrestling? What a great image. It underlines the fact that prayer is not just a passive encounter with God, but it can also be a way to wrestle with God on our own or someone else's behalf. Think of Jacob wrestling with God at the ford of the Jabbok River in Genesis. It's not that God is an adversary to be fought, but a great power to struggle with. I remember a sermon one of my mentors preached many years ago. Jim Horton, then the pastor of Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church in Houston, described a time when he went to visit a rabbi friend. When he was just outside the man's office, he heard him talking out loud to someone, and his rabbi friend was obviously arguing with whoever he was talking to. Jim at first thought there must be some silent person in there, or maybe he was arguing with somebody over the phone. But then he peeked into the open door to see that his friend was praying, and his prayer took the form of an argument with God. Jim's sermon point was that we take God seriously when we treat God as a conversation partner, one with whom we are free to argue, even if we know that God is ultimately right. I don't know if this is what Paul was referring to when he wrote about Epaphras wrestling in his prayers, but it's a great way to think about it. It means we're taking prayer seriously. It means we're taking God seriously. And it means we're praying about things that really matter to us. Epaphras was serious about the faith. The last we hear of him is in Paul's letter to Philemon, where Paul mentions that he was his fellow prisoner. And while we don't know whatever became of him, we know that he was a passionate minister of the gospel, willing to risk even his own freedom in order to spread the faith. Talk about wrestling. And now may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.